there, and welcome to the Philosophical Cowgirl. I'm your host, Sarah Geis, a former philosophy professor and current full-time horse person. This show is where the horse world meets the deep questions of life. In each episode, I'll share insights from my own learning process and sometimes discuss fascinating ideas with some of the brightest minds out there. I'm a relentless learner, so in this podcast, you get to ride along with me on that lifelong journey. Whether you're a philosopher at heart, a horse person looking for something new to listen to, or you're just curious about how these two worlds intersect, this is the show for you. Hey y'all, welcome to the Philosophical Cowgirl. This is the very first episode of what I hope is going to turn into a very long standing project. So this is something I'm pretty excited about. I'm Sarah Geis, your host, and I think that this first episode is a really good opportunity for me to introduce myself, introduce a little bit about why I'm doing this in the first place, what this even is, what it's supposed to be about, and what I think you're going to be able to get out of it. Essentially, a little bit of introduction, and then we'll get into an actual discussion of what the point of philosophy is, why I think I can blend it with the Western world and the equine world, and what you could potentially take away from a philosophical geared podcast. So let's launch into it. I am a little bit of a hybrid type personality. So I am both very into philosophy and theology. I've taught it for a long time. I've been out of the professional academic world for several years now, but I was in it for 8 as a teacher and then a long time before that as a student. So I did a good, 3 years, I think, in a PhD program at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And my PhD work was in philosophy of religion, specifically studying the work of a French philosopher named René Descartes, who I find fascinating. Might bring him in certain areas in the future, but he's definitely not somebody that everybody gets thrilled about or has even heard of. So I'm not going to bore you with those details. Anyway, I also have been involved with horses for as long as I can remember. So I'll give you a little bit of background on my story there. I was born in Texas, in Arlington, Texas, and grew up in Dallas. And I have ridden since I was, as long as I can remember. I was probably, I'm guessing 3 or 4 when I first started getting on horses, and not raised in a horse family, but was raised in a family with access to horses and the ability to foster that. And they were somehow guilted into submission and let me start taking riding lessons pretty early. So 4 or 5, I think, is when I started taking lessons. It was in the hunter jumper world. So started with hunter jumpers and was the barn rat kid, the classic kid that just couldn't get enough and wanted to stick around as much as possible and wanted to learn as much as possible. And I would ride anything that they put me on, and I was pretty thrilled to just be there. And got to the point when I was a little bit older, and when I was still doing hunter jumpers, when I would ride a lot of whatever lesson horse came in that needed a little bit of work, that maybe wasn't quite ready for the full-fledged program. So I learned how to ride bucks, learned how to ride refusals. So I got real sticky and never really had much confidence issue when I was small, which is probably for the best. But I was not able to buy my own horse at that time because they're expensive. We didn't have anywhere to keep the horse, all of that kind of stuff. So I set out to figure out what it would take to buy one, where I could keep it, all of that, and started saving up allowance money. And then my grandmother said to my parents that she would match whatever I put in if I wanted to buy a horse. And I think my parents probably rolled their eyes at that, thinking, oh, great, here we go. Thanks, Grandma. But it ended up to where I put in a certain amount. My grandmother put in a certain amount, the equal amount. And we, when I was 12, did end up buying a horse. And it turns out that allowance money and grandma's matching donation don't really buy you anything that's super broke and super trained. And we didn't really have a lot of extra funds for a trainer or lessons or anything like that. So I am a survivor of a 3-year-old off the track thoroughbred and no trainer. And I figured it out. I got thrown a bunch, never told my parents because I knew they'd make me sell him. And I was like, I'm doing this. We're in it, and I'm going to make it work. I ended up doing decently with that horse. We did some eventing, some 3-day eventing. I learned a lot about Liberty. I started playing with Liberty work and got him to where he's lunging without anything on his head, would bow, would do tricks, would all of that stuff. And so between that, the eventing, and all of that, it was pretty fun. Also got to where I was riding with a trainer a few years in who was helping me with that horse because that horse, Joey was his name, wouldn't load into a trailer very well. So from that point, I actually started working for that trainer, and that was a natural horsemanship trainer who was doing clinics and the State Fair Texas training demos and all of that stuff. And so I was fully immersed in the training operations and the business development end of things, where we were meeting people, talking to people, taking new horses, showing those horses to the owners after they'd been with us for a while, starting colts, starting problem horses, all of that stuff. So I did a lot of that. I probably spent more time and effort on that than I did on school, even though I've always been someone who loves learning, but I like learning on my own terms. I don't so much like learning when I'm forced to sit down and learn what someone else deems is important, which is not necessarily a strength, but that's something that I always kept with me, that I loved learning, that I loved growing, that I loved progress and figuring things out and all of that. Anyway, got to the point where I graduated from high school, moved to Colorado to go to Colorado State University, and started working for a trainer there that in Fort Collins who was a little bit more finessed and refined and show horse oriented, specifically Western pleasure horses, that really taught me a lot about body control and getting a horse more finished and getting horses more refined and subtle and able to detect your seat, different movements in your seat, different stillness, basically able to detect your seat change. That sort of thing was fascinating and was really great for me to learn. Still knew how to start colts, but I got better at it. And we also, in addition to working show horses and riding show horses, were taking in still quite a bit of what I would call the bottom of the barrel type horses. So I had to stay sticky, had to get stickier, had to get to where I could talk horses out of issues, out of having fights, and had to get to the point where I was pretty handy with de-escalating and then figuring out what was going on with the horse, what was going on with certain things that they were pulling on their owners, and understanding why they were doing that and how I could help them through it. And then how I could help the owner figure it out from there forward. That was extremely helpful. I was given lessons at the time. I was training a whole bunch of horses every day. And yeah, that sounds like, how do you go to school and do that? You don't 100% dedicate yourself to school is how you do that. I did that for several years, got to the point where I was pretty close to burning out, actually, and was really rekindling my interest in philosophy, theology, things like that, and decided to just fully switch. So I was still training 1 or 2 horses on the side, but I really dove into philosophy and theology more because I was thinking maybe there's something to this speaking and teaching and research thing, because I really do enjoy teaching. I really do enjoy learning and researching and and talking about it. Got to the point where I went to Denver Seminary after college, studied philosophy of religion there, and then went into my PhD work eventually after I had been teaching at Denver Seminary for a while. And then after my career seemed to be taking off, I started getting pretty disillusioned with the way that higher education worked and that the school in particular that I was at was being run and administered, and got to the point where I finally decided that I was going to leave, and I really missed the horses, and so I went back to that full time, and that was in 2019. So I've been back and forth between horses and philosophy and theology a lot, and never have been fully out of either one of them, but it has been just a series of varying percentages. So now, with this podcast, I'm thinking that I'm really going to be able to blend these two in a way that I've never been able to do before. I've thought about doing it over the years, but I had a major horse accident in April where I was riding a client horse that was a brand new client horse. And the horse flipped over backwards on me. The saddle horn hit me just below and to the left of my sternum, and had to be rushed out of there by ambulance, and was in the hospital for about a month. And then I was in recovery for over a month, and at home, actually at my parents' house, because I couldn't take care of myself at home for a while. And during that time, I did a lot of thinking about things I wanted to do and that I should get on, and this podcast is one of those things. I'm hoping that you appreciate it and that you enjoy it, and from here on out, you learn something. And I sure am going to learn things just preparing for them and doing them. So some of them are going to be just me, and others are going to be conversations with other people. Let's jump into today's topic, which is essentially how to bring the two worlds of philosophy and horses together. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun to share with you some of the things that I've come up with in trying to hybridize these two worlds. So first of all, who cares about philosophy? What if you aren't somebody who has any background in it or any interest in it, because you just see a bunch of, I don't know, guys in black rimmed glasses and man buns and beards trying to be cool and use big words? That's one of those things that I've been around a lot, and I'll tell you this, that good philosophy is important, and it doesn't require you to act cool or use big words. It comes from the Greek word philo, which is the love of, and then Sophia, which is wisdom. And like a lot of things, it can either be truth-oriented, so pursuit of truth-oriented, or it can be oriented toward boosting your own ego. And like I said, I've been around a lot of the ego stuff. Whenever I went to conferences, would speak at events, would discuss things in the classroom, there was always very hardcore philosophy-oriented people and professionals even who were obviously there to show off and show how much they know. And I just am nerdy and I love the information. I'm hoping that my desire to learn and my desire to grow will come through here more than any ego issue. One of the reasons that I got into philosophy in the first place is something that C.S. Lewis said in an essay that's called Learning in Wartime, which you can find in a collection of essays called The Weight of Glory and Other Addresses. What he said was, good philosophy must exist if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. And there is a metric crap ton, excuse my French, of bad philosophy. Bad reasoning, bad motivation, people who are in it for the ego, people who really don't care about truth at all, people who just want to make you skeptical to no end without any sort of resolution, without any sort of ability to arrive at truth or find truth. So those are reasons why I think it's really important for good philosophy to exist. It is also a lifestyle. So we can understand our world so much better through philosophical reasoning. Political philosophy is an example of this. You can understand a lot about why people vote the way they do, why people think the way they do politically, if you understand the spectrum of political philosophy, the history of political philosophy, what human nature does to people's minds, what human nature is even. Are people generally good? Are they generally evil? Is there a way to tell? I believe that people are a blend. I think that we're born a blend. I think that we are, and I'm a Christian, and my worldview says that human nature is our God-given created nature. So human nature is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. It is created good. We are meant to be good, but we have this thing called the sin nature that is tacked onto it and it mars it. And so we are a blend. We're not generally good. We're not generally evil. So politically speaking, I am not going to vote for any system that assumes that we are always going to make bad decisions. I'm not going to vote for a system that assumes we are always going to make good decisions, that we are generally good. Relationally, I'm also not going to approach people as though we are all good, although some people are better than others, but we all have a sin nature too. So there's going to be a mix, and again, you're going to have different percentages in each person. So I mentioned the worldview. Worldview studies is also something that is really interesting and really important that you can get into through philosophy, learning how people view the world, how different people have different lenses through which their world is colored. And that helps us to understand why people think the way they do and act the way they do. So people who seem crazy, so to speak, can be understood a lot better understanding their worldview. So we can understand why they may say things or do things that we don't like. So humans, the next thing that I want to talk about that's related to the previous one, that has to do with lifestyle, we're thinking things. We're naturally curious. And Socrates, the famous Greek philosopher, said the unexamined life is not worth living. Aristotle, similar era, he was a couple generations after Socrates in ancient Greece, said that man by nature desires to know. So if we don't desire to know, then we are weird. We're not being our natural selves. We do tend to want to figure things out and understand things. So if you're someone who's pretty content with not knowing, with not researching, with not learning, then this is probably not going to be the podcast for you. Now let's look at philosophy as a lifestyle a little bit more specifically. Good horsemanship, relationships, business practices, and being a good person, or being the best type of person you can be, living the good life. All of that requires thinking well. With philosophy, that's what we're trying to do, is learn how to think better, learn how to live better through thinking well. We can't just be smart people. You do have to be smart. Being dumb, I do believe, is probably an issue that some people can't overcome, but I think for the vast majority of people, being dumb is a choice, because you can always learn to read better, to attend to the world better, meaning pay attention is what I'm getting at. But we can't just be smart. We also have to train our minds to have discipline and perspective, which is a daily task. This looks like listening when we would rather talk, thinking things through instead of reacting, and being able to imagine other people's points of view when we really just want to fight. So what we do with our time, what we do with our thoughts, what we think about, how we think, is the sort of being we become. It creates who we are. So I'm not one of those people that thinks that if you think about it, it'll happen. Necessarily, it's not that simple. I'll just put it this way. If I think about being a cheeseburger, I'm not going to turn into a cheeseburger. That's nuts. But if I think about cheeseburgers all the time, I'm probably going to develop the desire to eat them, and it is going to cause a health issue unless I'm also thinking about fitness, thinking about needing more energy in my life, needing to feel better so that I can perform better when I'm riding, that kind of thing. Because I'm still riding. I'm still riding every day. Even after my accident, I've finally gotten to the point where I'm riding sometimes multiple horses, multiple times a day. I can't just think about cheeseburgers all the time. Although for me, it would probably be more like, I don't know, quesadillas or Mexican food, some Tex-Mex of some variety. Anyway, we need to figure out how to think well and how to use our minds in the service of what we're here to do and who we're here to be. So in Romans 12:2, it says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." In the Bible, and I'm not going to bring that up all the time. I am a Christian, so it's going to come into play with how I think and the sorts of things that I think are good resources. But in the Bible even, it talks about renewing your mind. A lot of times we think in the Bible it's all about faith and all about feelings and all about the heart and all of that stuff. In the Bible, there's not really a huge distinction between heart and mind, and it does talk about the mind quite a bit as important. Now, Rene Descartes, that philosopher that I studied in my PhD program, says something really interesting. He says, "For to be possessed of a vigorous mind is not enough. The prime requisite is to rightly apply it. The greatest minds, as they are capable of the highest excellences, are open likewise to the greatest aberrations," the greatest problems is what he's saying. "And those who travel very slowly along the road he was talking about may yet make far greater progress, provided they keep always to the straight road, than those who, while they run, forsake it," it being the road. So he's saying that it's great if you're smart, just like what I've said before. It's great if you're smart, that's fine, that's a good thing, but it's not enough. We also have to think well, we have to be disciplined, and we have to have perspective. That's what I'm hoping will come through on this podcast. So let's look at the horse world specifically. How does philosophy help in our endeavor to become better horse people, better people in the horse world? So one thing, I'm going to go through a few areas here. Ethics and virtue is philosophy, and trying to be a good person in business, trying to be a good client, trying to be better in the client-coach relationship, the client-trainer relationship, client-farrier relationship, those sorts of things. We also ethically need to figure out where we stand on things like horse slaughter, on things like Mustang roundups, things like bits and spurs and starting horses when they're young, and those sorts of things, because we're going to hear people's opinions on them that we don't necessarily agree with, but we don't know how to stand up against those sometimes and often false viewpoints. And a lot of that stuff is getting thrown at the horse world pretty hard in ways that may end up hurting our ability to do what we love if we don't stand up against it and say why it's wrong. So the next thing is, the next area where philosophy and horses can coincide here, is that how we gain knowledge is really important, and whether or not what we have is a knowledge thing or if it's opinion is really important. So knowing the difference between knowledge and opinion. Everybody has opinions, everybody has the right to opinions, but that doesn't mean that the opinions are right. What is important is knowing what opinions are probably more like actual knowledge. Knowledge is justified, true belief. So you have to have a belief first, then it has to be justified, so it has to have really good, strong reasons, and then it also has to be true. So just because you feel it, just because it's your opinion, doesn't mean it's true. So I do not believe that you can have your own truth. I think you can have your own experience, you can have your own perspective, you can have your own opinions, but whether or not it is true is a separate issue. And another podcast at another time might give us the opportunity to go into that a little bit in greater depth. Logic and critical thinking is also important. It's vital. It is the way that we reason. It's the way that we arrive at truth, the way that we arrive at knowledge, the way that we evaluate other people's truth claims and other people's opinions. And we need to be able to weigh all of those things. History is the next thing. History is something that we need to study as a philosophical discipline. So how do we look at history? Do we look at it as something to learn from? Do we look at it as something that only the winners write? Do we look at it as something that's a little more complicated than maybe we've previously thought? Do we romanticize history too much to the point where we can't see the dirt in it, the grittiness of it, the complicated nature of it? What do we do with history when our previously held heroes maybe seem like all of a sudden they weren't perfect? Do we throw them out? That's what a lot of today's culture says to do. In the horse world, we can look at history and figure out, okay, how did they treat horses in the past? How do we learn from that? That kind of thing. The nature of reality is another area that's essential that's a philosophical discipline. It's called metaphysics. Not metaphysics in any kind of weird sense, like woo, strange stuff, but metaphysics as a technical philosophical discipline, which is, like I said, nature of reality. Who we are, what are we here for, what is our relationship to other people, to animals, to God. All of that is going to determine how we act and operate and treat people and treat horses in this context that we're in, the horse world. The nature and existence of truth, whether or not truth exists, whether or not you can have your own truth, whether or not there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. Maybe there's no right way, but there's a wrong way. That happens a lot in horse training, where there's several right ways to do things, but there's also wrong ways. And sometimes that's because it doesn't work, other times because it's not ethical. It just depends on what you're talking about. So also we've got psychology and sociology. How people think, how groups think, what drives people to do certain things and to pursue certain things. In the horse world, that is very important with things like sports psychology, how to learn, what happens when you're not enjoying yourself anymore, maybe what happens when you're having confidence issues, that sort of thing. We're starting to run out of time. I'm going to wrap up now on the philosophy end of things and just talk about the podcast itself. So this podcast is not going to always be philosophy heavy in terms of the topic. A lot of times we'll talk about something pertinent to the horse world, but less philosophically inclined. It's always, though, going to be some sort of blend. So sometimes it'll be more philosophy heavy and less horse heavy, and sometimes the opposite. And it'll always, though, like I said, be some kind of hybrid of those two. I'm going to try to keep things between 30 minutes and an hour, sometimes less. And you'll hear opinions that you agree with, but you'll also hear opinions that you don't agree with. My goal is to give you plenty to think about and the tools to navigate through things that you're hearing that you may not necessarily have heard before, you may historically have not agreed with, but maybe even if you don't come to agree with them later, you at least walk away with more of an understanding of why a vet may have said that, why a trainer may have said that, why somebody else who I may have on here, or even myself, may have made a claim that you don't necessarily agree with. But if you understand it more, I'm hoping that'll help you to understand your own viewpoints a lot better. So, the next podcast is going to be on my accident story and specifically dealing with confidence and anxiety and how maybe I'm hoping that can help some of you in struggling with confidence and how to get back on horses after you've had issues and wrecks and things like that. Episodes are going to drop every Wednesday. It's currently on Spotify, but I'm hoping that it's going to pretty soon be on all of the major platforms. So thanks for your time, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap up because I can't just keep talking forever. And I hope you tune in and subscribe so that I can see you next time.